chairman of the Horseheads Republican Party, and thank you. We're looking forward to a very lively discussion tonight, and first I'd like to make a couple quick announcements. In case that there is an emergency, we do have 2 exits, one right here and one in the back. Bathrooms are right over here, and if there's an emergency call for the fire department, just make sure to stay out of their way. And also, in case you're not registered to vote, and don't raise your hand now, we're not trying to call anybody out, but there is, on the way out, there is a voter registration table that has forms. So, all right, so I'd like to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise and move your heads. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So I got to tell you, this is a wonderful crowd, and we didn't quite know what to expect, but I really got to say thank you to the Webbs Mills Fire Department for allowing us to do this here. I don't know if you followed the Facebook page, but we went through a couple of different iterations of sites that we were looking to do this at, and Webbs Mills has been wonderful. I know it's a little bit of a hike for some people, but this just goes to show that people that care about two-way rights, they don't care where it's at, they'll be there. They're the people that show up. They're the people that show up to the polls. They're the people that show up for the activist portion of things. So I just think that it's wonderful that we've got a great crowd. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank the people that have helped organize this event. We've got Greg and Joseph, and where's David, and Joe Atkinson. And Joe I've known for a number of years. He is a member of the Horseheads Republican Committee. He's one of the people that goes out and carries petitions for everybody every year. And he's one of the people that helped support the Facebook ads and getting everybody out here. So I'd just like to invite Joe up to say a couple of words.
Wow, what a crowd. I'm just going to say a couple of words, and that is, as Joe said, there's a voter registration table out back. If you haven't registered to vote, please do it. There are 3.2 million gun owners in the state of New York, and only 1.4 million people voted in the gubernatorial election. If those 3.2 million had voted their gun rights, we wouldn't have Cuomo today.
Yeah.
So please, on your way out, it might take a while in the line, but if you're not registered, please register and cast your votes on election day. And in the primaries, if you're eligible for a primary, vote, please. We need that, because we got to get rid of this guy. Okay.
Thank you, Joe. And as we get a little bit further along in this process, it's going to be important that not only are you registered to vote, but it's also going to be important to know which legislative district you live in, because Chemung County has 15 legislative districts. And I, as the legislator for the 4th district, I'm going to be one of the people that, if this were to come up to us, would have a say on it. And I just want to thank Rodney Strange for coming out to listen to what the message is. And Rodney, would you please stand up? One other point that I need to make clear is that with me being the chairman of the Horseheads Republican Party, we helped to advertise this event, but this is something that we are doing for informational purposes only. As a group, we have not decided specifically to endorse this particular proposal, but we feel as though it's important that voters who care about two-way rights have the opportunity to listen to a message like this. So it's important that we all know specifically what it is that we're looking to do here. And we have a great speaker lined up who does this professionally. His name's Steve Felano, and he is the founder of 2A NYS, which is a statewide organization which is, among other things, promoting the idea of having a 2A sanctuary county ordinance in all of the counties in New York. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Steve Felano.
Good evening, everybody. What a great sized crowd. I spoke in Delaware County about this issue probably going on a month ago, similar sized crowd, so it kind of goes to show the significant support that the concept, at least, of the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance has in upstate counties. So, as was mentioned, I'm Steve Felano with 2A NYS. We used to be called 2AWNY, sort of started as a Western New York-based organization, but found that with time, our approach to Second Amendment civil rights advocacy, which is a little different from the legacy 2A organizations that you're probably familiar with, NYSERPA, SCOPE, etc. We really don't work through legislators, or legislatures, I guess you could say. We're open to support from them and some participation with them on certain issues, but we've just come to understand and find that over the past decade plus of that approach, asking permission from Albany, from legislators, the results have not been good. That's given us the SAFE Act, it's given us the red flag law, et cetera, et cetera. And it's at a point now where with the green light law, giving the capability to those not here illegally to vote, what the state has done with respect to public campaign financing so they can squeeze third parties out of the mix. You're at the point now where the number, just numerically, you're not going to vote your way out of this. It's too late for that now. The leftist progressives have cemented their lock on electoral control moving forward. So now, basically, where you're at is working by, with, and through the people, non-compliance, non-enforcement, and repeal initiatives. And that's what we focus on, that's what we specialize in. So we really got our start a little over a year ago. Actually, it'll be a year tomorrow. Valentine's Day, we put on the record affirmatively from all 17 district attorneys in Western New York that they will not enforce the 7-round limit under the SAFE Act. And that may not be revelatory to everybody right now, because a lot of you probably know that portion of the SAFE Act was ruled unconstitutional, not just by the Western District, but also by the Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, which of course covers the entire state. The problem that we uncovered a little over a year ago was the fact that all across upstate, and I'm sure still downstate, in Warren County actually, I'll talk about that in a minute, it's happening right now, but all across upstate, there are district attorneys, there are police departments that are still enforcing that limit. So it just goes to show you, you can win a court victory, you have to go and compel these government agents to ensure that they're following those court orders. And what I found out not too long ago, out in Warren County, near where I'm from originally, there's a gentleman who got picked up because he had a very scary, legal assault weapon, legal under the imaginary gun laws that come out of Albany. And one of the things he was charged under, reviewing his paperwork, is the 7-round limit, which again, is unconstitutional, but the authoritarian progressives in Albany won't remove that language from the law, so it's still on the books in Albany. And of course, the issue becomes then, rookie cops that come onto the force, like the one who charged in this instance, don't know about this because the district attorneys aren't going out and, advising on this ad infinitum every couple weeks. But it's a problem for officers, it's a problem for departments, because someone like me can now sue them civilly for that. For charging under this imperial edict, basically, that's been found unconstitutional twice, and they're still enforcing these things. That's a major issue. So that's sort of where we got started, was ensuring that government agents are not enforcing these portions of what's really in total an unconstitutional law, but at least those portions that have been found to be unconstitutional by 2 courts, we can at least start there. So the successes sort of went on from there. We started with that. In April of last year, we were successful in reversing the first ever SAFE Act conviction in the state. So post-conviction, we reversed that. Then in July, we secured what was rather called a dismissal with prejudice, meaning that New York State cannot come back and charge the individual whose conviction we reversed again for the same thing. in county court. Moving on from there, we were able to, in August, secure a win against red flag style gun confiscation in Allegheny County. Very shortly, we're going to be announcing, more than likely, if our client will allow sort of his details to be released publicly, a win against the secret mental health law database that the governor has that's got over 100,000 names in it in this black hole, this black box. We don't know how it works, but we just know a lot of gun owners are in that black box for saying things that the state doesn't like, and so they're labeled mentally ill, and their firearms are taken away from them, and they're stripped of their pistol permit license, et cetera, et cetera. It goes to show just the abuses of the pistol permitting regime. And of course, the fact that there are no controls to protect gun owners with respect to this communist, secret police Gestapo type system that Albany has in place. We found out that a gentleman from the Warsaw, New York area went to get a stress test on his heart, hadn't been to the doctor in like 30 years, and due to a paper mix-up at the hospital, he ended up on this prohibited mental health law list and got flagged in the NICS system. The sheriff's deputies went and took his firearms from his house, took his permit away. And so we're in a situation now where we're gonna potentially sue the hospital, sue the state for the mistakes made, and basically be able to hopefully peel back the layers of this unconstitutional, secretive system and hopefully reverse it in total later on. So those are some of the things we've been able to accomplish, and then the latest thing that we're focused on doing, in addition to Second Amendment sanctuaries, which I'm gonna get to in a bit. But we announced on Monday a statewide lawsuit against the state's pistol permit regime, which is unconstitutional for numerous reasons, primarily because it relies on the subjective judgments of a single individual, your licensing official, your county judge, who for whatever reason can decide if he doesn't like the color of your hair that day. He can seek to deny you your permit or have your firearms confiscated, revoke your permit at any time. These things are unconstitutional. We don't treat any other civil right under the Bill of Rights that way. There's no permitting system for the First Amendment. There's no permitting system for the Fourth Amendment. There's no permitting system for the 14th Amendment. Why is it that way for the Second Amendment? Well, the answer for that is control. It's because the progressives in Albany want to control you, and they believe the way of life that is lived in an area like this is wrong, and they know better than you do. And they are personally repulsed by the idea of the average individual owning a firearm for self-defense or for defense against the government, which is the core purpose of the Second Amendment. We make that argument in every court case that we present to a federal district court. And we talk about the numerous atrocities that governments have committed against their people, because the progressives on the left, the every-counts of the world, the Bloomberg-backed elites of the world, like to play this body count game where they talk about, 40,000 people die from, modern gun violence in America every year. Cory Booker at Senate hearings on gun violence likes to talk about his view that, more people die per year from quote-unquote gun violence in the inner city than have every soldier in every American war that we've ever fought. So, what we like to do is take the progressives at their word. Fine, we won't look into the data that you're advancing to support your argument. Although, one of the things I always point out is those are mostly suicides, quite frankly, which the Second Amendment is not responsible for. But when you add up all those figures and you multiply them out by 100 to represent 100 years of modern American gun violence, you get a figure of 11.5 million deaths caused by quote-unquote modern gun violence. If we look at the number of people killed by their own government in the 20th century, that 100-year period, the number is 169 million. So generally the argument that we'll make, that's the same body count approach that the progressives take, the same data-driven approach, is that government is far and away more dangerous to modern society than any one individual with a handgun ever will be, or the modern government. So when progressives ask the question, when will you ever be open to more gun violence legislation? When will you ever be more open to more restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms? Well, the answer is when modern American gun violence increases by over 1,000%, because that would be at least touching the 169 million deaths that have been caused by government across the span of the 20th century. And then, you know, that deals with, you know, the Hitlers of the world, the Pol Pots of the world, the Mao Zedongs in China of the world, you know, all these, to younger folks, people younger than me, but around my age, that can kind of seem distant, far away. But, you know, let's also look at the modern instances of tyranny that are playing out in our hemisphere right now. You know, we like to advance this argument in court as well. You're going to have progressives make the argument that this whole idea that the government can turn tyrannical is paranoid, it's a conspiracy theory, there's no data to support this, it'll never happen. So you ask why? What is the metal, impenetrable guardrail that stops the US government, the progressives anyway, that get into power, from turning tyrannical and just rounding up all the conservatives, all the heritage Americans, all the people who think like we do, and sending them off to a re-education camp to make sure that they can play nice with the rest of society like they're doing in China right now to the weaker minorities? Well, the answer they like to give is, well, we have checks and balances, we have elections. We have all these procedural safeguards that will never be violated, although they make the argument every day that Trump has broken every one of those norms. So, I mean, I guess they sort of answer the question there that those quote-unquote safeguards don't safeguard anything at all unless everybody believes in them. But in any event, the argument I make is if we look to our neighbors in Venezuela, which is in the same hemisphere, and the demographics, at least in some parts of the country, look increasingly like Venezuela. Those, you know, the folks in that country had what the left referred to just a couple years ago as a model democracy, a socialist democracy, kinder, gentler socialism that we should seek to emulate until 2018, when their economy collapsed under the weight of socialism, and inflation increased by over 1,000%. People lost their jobs, they're starving in the streets. And now, current day, the remnants of the Venezuelan special forces are roaming the countryside, rounding up those who had protested against Maduro, President Maduro, at an earlier date, and shooting them to death in their homes. So that's what happens in a country that relies purely on institutional safeguards, because what folks may fail to realize is that people of that country were disarmed in 2012 under a gun control law that, if you translate it into English, reads just like the SAFE Act. It bans certain classes of firearms, blanket bans on classes of firearms, like AR-15s. It bans the capacity of magazines to a certain limit, an arbitrary limit. It bans certain caliber sizes. And it got to the point where basically you had to have a license to just own a .22 revolver. And then that got banned. So we can take a look at what happened in Venezuela as an example of maybe where we don't want to go and how the government can turn tyrannical unless the people have the right to keep and bear arms. We can look at what's happening in China right now, as I alluded to a few moments ago, regarding what's happening with their weaker minority population. This is another factoid I like to confront the progressives with. Little known fact, although widely reported by the New York Times and The Guardian, those two outlets got their hands on internal documents from Xi Jinping's government that quote him as saying to his lieutenants when he decided he wanted to round up the minority Muslim population there and send them to these modern concentration camps. He said, look at what the United States did following 9/11 when they launched the National Security Administration and their surveillance state. I want you guys to go and recreate that in Xinjiang province and use that surveillance system to round up these people and send them to the camps. So there's clear evidence that a system we have in place right now that is monitoring everybody's communications all across this country has been hijacked by a communist government and recalibrated for their own anti-liberty purposes. There's no clearer evidence than that the wrong person in power with access to that system can bring tyranny about and spread it all across the country. And then, of course, the examples go on. We have Hong Kong, where protesters are being shot in the street, unarmed protesters. And then, of course, another little known example would be from a year ago in Canada, so a country much more similar to us than, let's say, Venezuela. The RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, it was uncovered through leaked documents once again, that their SWAT teams had developed a standard operating procedure to deal with protests of indigenous populations against pipeline drilling. that they could simply just shoot them all. They could just shoot the unarmed protesters if it got to be too much of a problem. If they fought back and threw rocks and stones and, you know, got a little too out of hand, they could just massacre them like happened at Kent State. This is what happens in a country where you don't have the right to keep and bear arms codified in your constitution, like Canada does not. Eventually, the powers that be overstep their bounds, and this has happened in literally every country where this has been an issue. And the only reason why it hasn't happened in America is because we have the Second Amendment. So to the progressives in Albany, I say the Second Amendment works. It works. It worked for patriots in 1775. It worked for those defending America against foreign invasion in 1812. It worked during World War II when it demonstrated to the Japanese that they could not invade the mainland United States because there would be a rifle under every blade of grass. It worked in Fort Worth, Texas, shortly after Christmas, when a single-armed civilian stopped an armed killer attack in 6 seconds. Conversely, 2 days earlier, there was a stabbing attack in Muncie, New York, where I was recently. Those people don't have really what I consider to be the right to keep and bear arms. They're on the doorstep of New York City. The only thing that the rabbi at home could do is throw a table at the guy. And that's really the impetus for our pistol permit lawsuit, which anybody in this room can join if they like. You can find out more about it at 2anys.com. But the impetus for that was the fact that these anti-Semitic attacks, again, proved that the Second Amendment works, that disarming the Muncie population, the Orthodox Jewish population, is not the answer. And I've come to find over the past several months with more and more of the Orthodox Jewish population reaching out to me that they all want to be armed. And a lot of them have tried to be, but they suffer under this system of blanket concealed carry permit denials that come from a cabal of conspiratorial judges in Rockland County. And so on the 18th of this month, on Tuesday, we're going to be holding a press conference in front of their offices to say we're going to sue them. Because we're not going to stand for Second Amendment civil rights infringement. And not only are we doing it in Rockland County, we've already done it in Erie County, but not only are we doing it in those 2 counties, but every county all across the state. This will be a statewide class action lawsuit, presumably with upwards of 300 litigants that we'll be able to send all the way up to the appeals court, the highest court in New York State, where we're pretty sure we're not going to get a good ruling, and then send it out to the federal court system and on to the U.S. Supreme Court if need be, where in that court system there exists a conservative majority of Trump appointees. Who are going to be more open to the correct interpretation of the Second Amendment, the requirement for a strict scrutiny standard that holds the government's feet to the fire when they say they want to impinge upon the Second Amendment, forces them to make an argument based on data, which they almost never do in this state. And we do believe over time it will prevail. And that's what's going to bring me, the existence of these conservative majorities, because the Second Circuit that oversees New York State is about to flip majority conservative Republican as well. The existence of that environment in the federal court system is exactly why you want to be moving ahead with Second Amendment sanctuary ordinances right now, because they're probably going to be upheld by those courts. New York State's not going to uphold them, but the federal court system likely will. And I want to get into why that's the case. And the approach that I believe is going to work in most counties to bring about a Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance where you at least have a majority of elected officials who believe in your Second Amendment civil rights, the true meaning of it. When you broach this with your elected leaders, sort of the missteps that I've seen all across the state is a situation where a person or a group prints off the Gun Owners of America ordinance and they drop it on a legislator's desk or a sheriff's desk or a district attorney's desk and say, we want to be a Second Amendment sanctuary county, so go make it happen. And they just walk out of the room, that's it. You know, that's the end of the discussion. It's problematic for a lot of different reasons, the least of which is the fact that it's going to be, excuse my language, but it's that guy's, the legislator's ass in the sling if this thing gets passed. And then the governor tries to remove that person from office, which will happen, 100%. tries to sue that county, which will happen 100%, and then cuts off the funding to that county, which will also happen 100%. You need to be very upfront, truthful, and honest with your legislators that all those things are 100% going to happen, most definitely, and demonstrate that you've done the research into those consequences. And now we get into the plan to mitigate those consequences to the extent that you possibly can. And this is the argument that I find that resonates the best with sheriffs and law enforcement officers, because what is a law enforcement all about? It's about going into dangerous situations and having a standard operating procedure, an SOP in place, based off of prior lethal force events that mitigates the risk of the event that you're about to enter. And that's what sort of my approach to the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance is all about, is an SOP to mitigate the county's risk when it comes to being sued, which will happen. So we want to make sure that we prevail, right? So what's the argument that needs to be made with respect to that I think should really be in the ordinance? And it's simply this. Well, we agree with New York State. We agree with the Attorney General. We agree with all the arguments that were made in the green light lawsuits in the Western District and the Northern District, because if you read them, it cites the same principles that are in that sanctuary ordinance. The New York State's already giving you the argument that you need to win against them. In the context of the green light lawsuit, the very last page of Letitia James's reply, she cites the 10th Amendment, or I assume an attorney working under her who drafted it did, cites what's called the anti-commandeering rule, which has been upheld by 5 different U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And the anti-commandeering rule is all about telling the federal government that they cannot commandeer state law enforcement resources to enforce their own laws. It's the same rule doctrine that the state of Missouri has used to tell the feds we won't enforce any federal gun control laws. And the state is 100% within the rights to do that. When Mickey Kearns launched the green light lawsuit, and Frank Marola did the same thing in the Northern District, and I read the briefs and everything, and I speak at events like this pretty routinely throughout really every month of the year. A lot of conservative supporters of those 2 individuals were disappointed to hear me say, very likely they're going to lose those lawsuits, or they're going to be dismissed for lack of standing, which is what the latter happened, because the state is 100% within its rights to exercise its 10th Amendment right to not be commandeered by the federal government. And frankly, I think we want to preserve that right. Traditionally, the way that we have approached our issue with gun control in New York, that's very different from the way we're doing it now with Second Amendment sanctuaries, is to defer to the feds, right? Chris Collins, my former congressman, is unfortunately went to jail now. His whole approach was to pass what's called the Second Amendment Guarantee Act, the SAGA. Anyone familiar with that? Well, basically, it never got passed, because that's the issue, unfortunately, with a lot of Republicans in Albany who say they're pro-Second Amendment. It's all lip service. They've not done a single thing. Enough of them voted for the SAFE Act. That's why you have it. Enough of them have allowed red flag law to go through. That's why you have it. That's why we tend to not necessarily work very much through the legislature because of that issue, because we don't like to ask permission for things that are in the black ink of the Constitution. But in any event, I can digress on that for a while. But in any event, the issue with the Second Amendment Guarantee Act is it simply says New York State cannot pass any gun control that is more stringent or restrictive than the federal government. So the problem with that is you're definitely going to get it at some point in time, probably not the next election, because I do believe Trump will win the next election. But after his it might be the next election, it might be the one following that, you're going to get a Kamala Harris type Democrat in office who is going to leverage executive orders to progress a gun control mission. 100%, that's going to happen. So if you have a law on the books at the state level that defers to the feds at that point, that's the end of the game for you. The Second Amendment Guarantee Act does not play the long game. And again, this is the issue I have with, once again, totally working with the legislators' legislative fealty, is you generally get a legislative package that serves the purposes of a single elected official from a PR standpoint for just the next election cycle. That is saga. It doesn't look at the totality of this. What about the next several generations coming down the pipe? who are gonna suffer under a Kamala Harris type regime. If you've put SAGA in place, that's the end. So you wanna preserve the ability of the states and then also the counties and localities to not participate in various enforcement mechanisms, to opt out. That's a very important right that the state has, as long as they're not infringing on constitutional rights. This is where I think a lot of conservatives get concerned with me when I say that, is when I talk about 10th Amendment, is, well, then they can just infringe on the Second Amendment. Well, no, the 10th Amendment is part of the Bill of Rights. Doesn't let you then ignore other parts of the Bill of Rights. That isn't how it works. It deals with other issues that are not, negative rights, meaning rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights that don't infringe upon other people's liberty to make them happen. Gun control is all about infringing on other people's liberties to make it happen. Progressives, what they like to engage in is what's called mass liberty reduction for the purposes of emotional therapy. Because the reason that progressives love gun control, and I got in this discussion with this guy doing a documentary downstate over the phone the other day, he wanted to understand, when I get in these arguments with all these leftists in Orange County about gun control, the guy's a videographer, he's like, my videographer friends shoot videos for Moms Demand Action, I can't make him get it. And I said, well, the problem is you're looking for logic there, and there's a wall. It's like talking to a wall right there. This is all emotional. This is all about the fact that progressives cannot grapple with the fact that there's always going to be violent people in the world, and some of them are going to have access to firearms, unfortunately, and that's going to result in some type of violent outcomes. And they don't want to accept that.
They're gonna still have access even if they do pass this stupid ass gun law.
Well, yeah, exactly. So that's sort of the point that I'm getting to, is all the data, right? So Boston University has studied this, Harvard University has studied this as recently as March of last year. There's a New York University law professor who put out a book in November of last year. So this is all literally in 2019. The book is called The Toughest Gun Control Law in the Nation. It looks at the SAFE Act. None of these people are pro-gun. They all believe that gun control is a good thing, even if the data doesn't support this. They've all come to the conclusion, the Boston University and Harvard University study clearly demonstrates that the SAFE Act has done zero to reduce suicides and has done zero to reduce the homicide rate. Nothing. None of that at all. And then the NYU professor goes on to articulate that the SAFE Act is simply a statement of moral revulsion to private gun ownership, because there's so many things in that law that are just made up, are not enforceable in any way, shape, or form. Let's take, for example, the ammunition registry that never got off the ground. We're 6-7 years later. It's because the technology doesn't exist. No one thought to ask that question in Albany, because they didn't pull law enforcement on this. They didn't look. It's just a wish list. It's just in our perfect world, this is what we'd like to see. We'd like all the guns to just go poof, magically go away. So that's sort of what you're dealing with. So when you look at all these gun restrictions, you're not dealing with any rhyme, reason, or fact. You're dealing with this very emotional, visceral, sort of yearning on the part of progressives who just are not like fully formed adults apparently in that way, that this violence not exist in the world, and that we're better than this, and that in a modern society these things should just go away. And of course when they advance these gun control proposals, they never answer my question, which is the government tyranny argument. The courts never do either. And I always ask the question, okay, well, so if you're going to pass this restriction that disarms the civilian population and removes some of the most effective tools for individual self-defense, small arms like the AR pattern rifle, or a standard capacity Glock 17 that can run 17+1. If you're going to do that, then what other corresponding check are you going to place against the government with respect to their ability to project offensive force against we the people? And they never want to answer that question because, of course, they're going to say nothing, because we're benevolent. Of course, we're never going to harm you. Even though you hear folks from the Bernie Sanders campaign, the Bernie Brown shirts, talking about how they want to put us all in gulags.
Yeah.
If Bernie gets elected, it's very clear that's the direction that they want to go down. It's very obvious that the end state of the progressive utopia is all of us locked up in chains in some re-education camp to ensure that we believe what the left believes. That's the only way that type of society works, where it can sustain itself. So that's what gun control is all about. And folks, maybe your colleagues who've left New York State saying it's a lost cause, forget about it. I'm going to go to a state, I don't know, like Virginia, that respects gun rights and is never going to be a problem ever. And you're never going to have a gang of far left autocrats come in and pass all this gun control. But wait, that did happen. That's exactly what occurred. And the point I'm trying to make there is, if you don't cut this stuff down where it breeds, in states like New York and California, it's going to spread. It's a tumor. It's a cancer. And it's going to go all across the country. It's going to grow until we are the USSR, or we end up like the UK or something like that, where everybody's disarmed and now they're trying to ban knives. It's just ridiculous. So that's the reason that it's so important to stay in the state and fight. And the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinances are a critical part of that. A day following Governor Cuomo's State of the State agenda, I got together with my team in Buffalo the very next day at 10 a.m. and we did our own address. It's called the Year of Defiance Agenda 2020. And it's a roadmap for Second Amendment advocates all across the state to not just like have an emotional therapy session about like why we disagree with gun control, but it's a concrete plan that illustrates how you can obstruct, defy, disregard gun control in the state. And part of that plan was expanding the autonomy of local governments, which backs right into Second Amendment sanctuaries. So getting back to the 10th Amendment anti-commandeering elements of my discussion here that I mentioned earlier, that's what all that's based off of. So the argument that you want to make with respect to the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance is a couple things. You want to open it by saying, this is an ordinance that states that we, the people of Chemung County, agree totally with New York State and Attorney General Letitia James and all the arguments outlined in her litigation regarding the green light lawsuit in Western New York and Northern New York specifically. We agree with her argument on the 10th Amendment, stating that a government that is above ours in hierarchy and extracts compulsory taxes from us and then uses that as a cudgel against us to tell us what to do all the time. We do not have to offer up our own law enforcement kind of resources to enforce state laws. Now, it's very important that you also state that no part of this ordinance should be construed as a preemption on state law, or an overruling or supersession of state law. It's simply an opt-out. It just says we're not going to participate, because what you're hearing right now from sheriffs and county legislators and district attorneys and Cuomo and everybody in Albany regarding Second Amendment sanctuary ordinances and Moms Demand Action and the whole Bloomberg cabal is that this is a preemption of state law. These people are overruling, us, the Democrats, the leftists, the majority, the tyranny of the majority. They're not playing nice in the sandbox with everybody. Which it is true, we're not playing nice in the sandbox with everybody, but we're not superseding state law, we're not preempting state law. We're just saying the county's not going to participate in the gun control scheme. If you want to send the state police in, you 100% can. And that's important for everybody to understand. State police can come into your county at any time and enforce the SAFE Act and enforce the magazine, capacity limits and all the other ridiculousness. But I think we all know the state police, they don't have the resources or the manpower to do that. It's never going to happen. One of the arguments made by that NYU professor I referenced earlier in his book is one of the biggest blunders of the SAFE Act was not getting with county law enforcement earlier in the process and getting them on board. Because county law enforcement and your municipalities, your local law enforcement, towns and villages, that's the largest volume of law enforcement officers in the whole state. If you can't get them on board with this, you might as well not have the law, which is what the ordinance is all about. We know we can't repeal the law. You're never going to get legislative relief. Albany's never going to repeal this thing voluntarily. We saw that with something as simple as the separate element. It never took it off the books. Reversed by 2 courts, still not going to do it. They're not going to erase that thing unless Trump himself walks into Albany and forces their hand with an eraser across the thing. It's never going to happen. So what we have to do is stop fighting this culture war like it's World War II, like it's first or second generation warfare. This is Afghanistan. This is Iraq. This is fourth and fifth generation asymmetric warfare that you're fighting against a better resourced enemy, but that has conventional strengths and therefore conventional weaknesses. They are very well set up to defend against and swat aside very easily the traditional attempts at reversing and blocking gun control, which is working through the legislature, going to Albany and having the rally, saying, please, please, pretty please, don't do this again. We're asking you, please, permission to exercise the rights that are in the Constitution. So my proposal is we stop doing that stuff because it's not effective, and we start innovating and doing things that are strategic, that focus on what can the average citizen, we the people, do every day to re-secure our Second Amendment civil rights. And really, if you look at what the success of the progressive left in gun control depends on, it's an enforcement arm, number one. If you don't have a well-resourced, well-populated law enforcement arm that believes in the mission of gun control and will enforce it, in pockets of the state it won't exist, at least it won't exist fully. And then also, if you don't have the will of the population, the people, over which Albany believes they rule, if they're not on board with this type of legislation, again, it in essence will eventually cease to exist. So the focus should be on non-compliance initiatives, which, well above 80%, at least in New York, well above 80% of the population out there is not complying with the SAFE Act. They're not recertifying their pistol permits. I mean, you can go to a range out there with a standard configuration AR-15 and be training with that right next to an Erie County Sheriff's deputy, and he's just going to look at that and say, can I check that out? I mean, he's not going to do anything about that. I know that's the case in a number of counties all across the state. So that's already going on. The seed's already planted, and we just want to make that grow. So there's non-compliance, there's the non-enforcement initiatives which the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinances are all about. And going back to the argument on that, what we want to do is demonstrate to county officials that we have a plan in place to support them, and we have their back. That's why the prior method I talked about, which is like throw the ordinance on their desk, let them read it and figure it out, and say pass it, and whatever the consequences are that sucks for you, deal with it. That's not a good approach. You want to lead with the green light lawsuit background. That is the legal foundation. We want to insert those components into the ordinance, right? To just basically tell New York State, we agree with the arguments you've made against the feds. So we're saying that if New York State can say to the feds that we don't have to enforce your laws and we can lock you out of the DMV system and not share resources with you, the counties can do the same thing. The same power dynamic exists. The same coercive relationship exists. In many ways, it's worse. As recently as 2017, the New York State Bar Association, which is no friend of the right, the grassroots right, it's pretty much all far-left people in the New York State Bar Association. Even they drafted a study ahead of the Constitutional Convention that was upcoming that year that came to the conclusion that the Home Rule Clause of the New York State Constitution, which is one of the most expansive in the nation, that allows local governments wide authority to determine their own affairs and pass their own laws without interference of Albany. Over the past 50 years, the state has picked away at that, to the point now where if they just hint that they're going to pass a law on something, that's the end of it for the county. They can do nothing on that. It's over. And there's numerous instances of the state just straight up taking over water authorities, taking over school systems, just coming in and imposing their view on everything and saying this is the way you're going to do it because we know better than you. Our paternalistic view is that we know better than you and this is how it's going to be. So we want to go back to a situation like the one that's outlined in the home rule clause. We want to be bringing that back, and the way to do that is through ordinances like the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance, and frankly, it should extend beyond that. This is, I think, is just the beginning of localities taking back the rights that they've lost, and this is in essence, the check against the tyranny of the majority in New York State, because again, I don't think you're going to get relief from this through the legislature. The left has consolidated their electoral majorities through things like the Green Light Law, through things like public campaign financing, which they've used as a weapon against third parties now. And frankly, the Republican Party too, which they're rapidly making into a third party in the state too by what they're doing. So electorally, you don't really have any remedies there. And you can look to that as a clue for what's going to happen nationally as well. Now, the left is going to go apoplectic over the fact that Trump gets reelected, and they're already going crazy over the fact that they couldn't get him on impeachment. Like, if you listen to all the commentary in New Hampshire at the Democrat primaries, the general feeling is one of disgust and dismay because they didn't get Trump on impeachment, and he seems to be untouchable, which is probably all true. And you know, again, very likely he's going to get a second term, but that the Democrats are going to be intent on making that the last term. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to try and pack the Supreme Court, which Trump has been very good at stacking with conservative judges, and that's been very helpful to what I'm doing. And then also, you know, they're going to opt out of the Electoral College, which is the circuit breaker for you know, the bulwark against the tyranny of the majority for the United States population. We don't even have it anymore in New York State. It's just the tyranny of the majority rules in the state now. There's no circuit breaker. The issue with that is what you see over time is that foments a lot of unrest, and there ends up being some type of conflict. Like in this country, we're already basically, we're in a civil war right now. It's just not a violent one. It's a cold civil war. We don't want it to become a violent civil war. That's why the left should allow Second Amendment sanctuary counties to exist. And frankly, why there should be more states. You know, the fact that we still only, you know, the fact that we don't have 52 plus states is kind of ridiculous to me. You know, I'm downstate quite a bit, building a lot of chapters of this organization. There's actually a substantial hunger for what we're doing in counties like Rockland and Dutchess and Westchester, all of where we're going to be launching chapters throughout the coming weeks. You know, they point out New York City is a different state. It's not the same as even Rockland. It's definitely not the same as up here. It just makes total sense for them to be a different entity. You know, and it also prevents violence later on. I mean, it does. It prevents all this conflict that's storing up, that's brewing right now. So it just makes sense that Albany should let these things happen and just kind of take the chips and cash out of the casino. You got the SAFE Act 6 years ago. You passed it under cover of darkness through a message of necessity. You got your security blankie that makes you feel safe, although it does nothing. Take the chips and get out of the casino. It doesn't mean that everybody all across the state has to abide by this thing, especially in counties where we've never even had a mass shooting ever. So, Second Amendment sanctuary ordinances are the way to go. The green light lawsuit, the arguments made there by the state should undergird the proposal. That argument should be made to law enforcement officials and county officials that we're going to be making that argument in the ordinance. That backs into the legal strategy, which is this: when the state sues the county with respect to this, the pickle they're going to be in is those two lawsuits in the Western District and the Northern District are already being appealed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and those cases take forever to turn through. We have an active case there right now with respect to the pistol permitting regime that we're still waiting for a decision on a year later. Those lawsuits will be going on during the same time frame that they're suing the county. So they're going to be in this very awkward position where they're going to have to make a choice. Either they're going to argue against the county and say, no, all your 10th Amendment arguments are wrong and unsubstantiated. Our preemption rules and clauses overrule everything you're doing, and the anti-commandeering rule is bunk, it doesn't mean anything. If they say that, then they just destroy their argument in the Second Circuit, and they're going to have to stop giving licenses to illegal aliens. They're going to have to make a decision. You can't have both, logically, and a federal court's going to see that. The state system is going to go, well, if we let you do this, it's going to be very inconvenient for the state to pass gun control laws and have them enforced, so we're going to rule against you, even though logically you're right. But when you get into the federal court system, they're going to see through that, more than likely. There's definitely more of a chance now than ever before that they will, and probably rule in your favor. And then, of course, not to mention, if we're just looking at this from a self-preservation standpoint, an electoral victory standpoint, for those district attorneys, those sheriffs, those county legislators that are going to be up for re-election in the next 3 to 4 year cycle, which is probably many, you run on this as a campaign issue like Trump runs on impeachment, 100%. If you're the guy, or you're the legislative body that put the middle finger in Cuomo's face on gun control with this thing, and he tried to remove you from office, and that happens during an election season for you, or that type of thing's popular, that's your campaign right there. That's what Trump's doing right now. And we can virtually guarantee that elected body that we're going to be appealing this thing for the next 3 or 4 years. You're not going anywhere. You're going to be in the same position you are now while we do all this. And then not to mention the fact that our organization is going to litigate that for free. We're going to fund it just like we've done all our cases, which is on donations from the Second Amendment civil rights community. It's how we won the SAFE Act case and reversed that. It's how we reversed the gun confiscation case in Allegheny County. It's how we're going to win this case against the pistol permit in the Second Circuit and the statewide one that we're going to be launching, or that we have launched as effective as Monday. So, you know, the concern on the part of the county that, oh my God, we're going to have to reach into the county coffers to defend against this thing in court. No, you don't. And I can guarantee you that any county attorney you have on staff does not have the expertise, which is 40 plus years, that our legal team has, litigating specifically constitutional issues, and more specifically Second Amendment issues, and more specifically than that, SAFE Act and red flag law issues. So we're better situated to do it. We're not charging any money to do it. We're doing it because we want to see the movement succeed. So, you know, those I think are the arguments that need to be placed before county legislators. Sort of the legal argument for this is simply one that the state's already made. If the state wants to argue against it, then they're going to fail with their current lawsuits in the Second Circuit. And also from a campaigning standpoint, if you're doing this in a county where the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance is wildly popular, as evidenced by the number of people in this room, it's a winning electoral victory for you come campaign time. So that's sort of the direction I think all this needs to go in. Involving the county officials I've spoken with and the sheriff's deputies, etc., they've been pretty favorable to it. And I guess just in summation, I've probably gone on for long enough at this point. I want to take your questions if you have any. In summation, you know, talking to county sheriffs who are reticent to do this, who make the argument that, well, if we stop enforcing and ignoring gun control laws, we could, you know, people could ignore any law, like the law against murder and molestation and rape and everything. Well, one, that's not true, because what we're talking about here is non-enforcement of a law that's clearly unconstitutional. It's a right. It's the Second Amendment in the Constitution. It's in the black ink of the founding document. There's no constitutional right to rape or murder or any of that. So that argument is patently false. And it's also generally, you know, county sheriffs who are ready to retire and they don't want to rock the boat, and they're concerned about their pension, et cetera, and things like that. And I understand all that, but, you know, at some point in time, a stand needs to be taken for the heritage principles of the people of the state. You know, the people in upstate, and I'm coming to learn a large portion of people downstate that agree with their viewpoint and are quite frankly sick of having their rights infringed even more than we are. I mean, try getting a concealed carry permit in Rockland County. It's almost impossible. Unless you grease the right palm of the right person and pay them off, you know, it just shows that the system is corrupt as well. At least in the discovery process of our lawsuit, we were able to uncover that. So, you know, the other thing that I mentioned to law enforcement on this is that supporting the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance and this movement as a whole is good for the safety of your officers. Here's why that is. The left has already demonstrated that it hates law enforcement. Colin Kaepernick and his supporters hate cops. The green light law is anti-law enforcement. Bail reform is anti-law enforcement. The SAFE Act too is anti-law enforcement. They never consulted law enforcement when they drafted that. They just steamrolled them. I mean, the left has literally done everything they possibly can to demonstrate to police that they hate them. The grassroots right and heritage Americans, like many in this room, have consistently demonstrated that we support law enforcement. So why not support this issue, which we very fervently support, because we've supported you. If you don't, then you start to erode the confidence of this community in law enforcement. And then you have no community of support. Because again, the left already hates you. Why turn your friends on the right against you? Again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. The country's already in a civil war. We're already balkanizing, meaning we're splitting apart. And governments should allow states to split apart if they would like to do that. And they should give counties the same power to break away with respect to gun control enforcement and other issues as well. In 2020 America, every government institution is political now. There's no escaping that. There are some members of law enforcement who've been around for a long time, maybe got into a department in the 70s or 80s, who were used to the idea that Albany passes the law, we just enforce it. We don't question anything, we don't consider whether or not it's constitutional, that's no longer acceptable, because the left has become so authoritarian. You have to exercise your own judgment. And frankly, the oath that you took to uphold and defend the U.S. Constitution compels you to do that. So you need to uphold your oath and simply recognize the reality of the situation that we're in this country and in this state, which is every government agency is political. We're in a state of civil war right now, and you have to pick a side. Pick the winning side, and pick the side that supports you. That's everybody in this room. That's the grassroots right. That's Heritage America. So that's all I have. I want to turn it over to any questions folks might have at this point.
What do we do as people? What can we do to help this issue? Besides come to these meetings?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch that you can do. You can meet with county legislators and sheriffs and district attorneys on this issue. You know, you can join our organization and grow chapters, which is supremely helpful in addressing lawsuits that, you know, we've had a 100% win rate in court so far. So I think taking advantage of the climate in the federal circuits right now and on the U.S. Supreme Court, that's our biggest peaceful weapon right now. That's the best hope we have of reversing some of these gun control edicts is reversing them in the courts. So as many lawsuits as we can get passed, or as we can get through the court system, the better off we're going to be, because the state can't catch every single one, right? So if you look at the NYSERPA lawsuit, if everyone's familiar with that, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus New York City was heard on December the 2nd of this year. And that all focuses on a very narrowly tailored suit that deals with a firearms transport rule in New York City. And basically states that if you live in the city, you can't leave city limits with your firearm to train at a range outside the city. So NYSERPA challenged that suit, and the Supreme Court decided to hear it, much to the dismay of New York City and the state Senate and Cuomo. So they repealed the law. They repealed the law in the city, and then the state Senate passed the law repealing it again. And they're hoping to basically do what's called mooting the case, meaning there's no live controversy anymore, so we just dismiss the case. So it kind of goes to show that the left is scared of how the courts are going to rule on this when you get outside the appellate court and you get outside the state court system. So we need to be leveraging that, because they caught that one. I mean, it's still being decided, but it's probably not going to be mooted. But you're probably not going to get as strong a ruling as you otherwise would have gotten if all this hadn't happened, if they maybe chose something like the pistol permitting law or the SAFE Act, right? So we need to get people better organized, communicating more efficiently. Like a couple of the things I talked about in my Buffalo address the day following Cuomo's address is the concept of civilian police review boards with respect to red flag law gun confiscation, right? We have all these leftist civilian police review boards that review lethal force that officers may have to, inflict upon people in the course of daily duty. What if we had a civilian review board that acted kind of like a volunteer fire company that worked in partnership with police, that when they're going to do a confiscation order, they tone out to these volunteers, and they're just there to be stenographers. They're there to notate the personal risk that the officers are put in every time they have to go and confiscate a weapon. And anytime that something happens to these officers, that's documented as well. And again, in these civil rights infringements in addition to that, and basically how the whole system progresses from the time of the knock on the door to the person's firearms actually being taken away. And that starts to peel away the onions of how the state is abusing the red flag law and the pistol permitting system. And a lot of folks don't even understand that you could red flag someone long before the red flag law. I mean, the case we won in Allegheny County in August relied totally on an affidavit that was notarized and someone being the judge's friend. That's all it took for him to send the deputy out. No warrant presented, just give me the guns. Bye. And just left. That's one of the reasons we won the case, is we uncovered that. And they didn't want that on the record in a cross-examination, so they just dismissed the whole thing. But that's, that type of grassroots organizing and strategic thinking is important. And one of the things that we focus on with respect to what we're doing at 2A NYS is more media engagement. So we're very proactive about sort of the messaging war with respect to gun control. So we hold our own press conferences on things, like before the Bloomberg people do. Like if the Bloomberg people are going to have a Moms Demand Action meeting, we literally go and do a press conference at the same location 30 minutes ahead of time. And we rebut all their arguments. And it used to turn into a big debate right there, like in public, and they would lose it. And then they just stopped having meetings in most of Western New York, which is the goal. That impacts their ability to recruit. It weakens the machine. So strategic thinking, better grassroots organizing, and all that's going to lead to more lawsuits because more people communicating means we can get more plaintiffs and organize them. And again, the more of these suits we can get outside the state court system, the better chance we stand of having these things reversed in the federal court system. So all those things are things that we have to do. And
What's the authority that Cuomo has to go after a legislator that is trying to push this law? You said, trying to get him removed. What's his authority there?
Yeah, so there's, sort of broad authority read into the state constitution and the preemption rules that the state has in place that allow a governor to do that. It's a fairly subjective test to determine whether or not, the county official is not carrying out his duties, per the opinion of the governor, which offers room to litigate that, right? And say, well, actually, if he is carrying out his duties, he's upholding the U.S. Constitution and refusing to enforce, basically an illegal law that violates federal law. So that it leaves some room to litigate that, but that's basically it. And a point that I failed to make up here that I'll make right now with respect to that is we want the governor to do all those things that I talked about. A lot of people are concerned, especially sheriffs I've heard from, that he's going to try and do that. That would be outstanding because it will show that he's overreacting. And the left is very emotional. They do not think through how they react to things. We saw that in Virginia. The way that the Virginia Democrats reacted to the grassroots organizing with respect to Second Amendment supporters demonstrates they don't think about all the potential outcomes. And I think we do a better job of that, so we should leverage that. We want to push the left to the point where they become very emotional and overreact, and that's going to give us an opening to, at least set up a situation where they're hesitant to pass future gun control laws, they do something which precludes them from doing so. In most events, it's going to make them do something that triggers a constitutional challenge. And you can tell the governor is very cognizant about that now, given the environment on the Supreme Court with the conservative majority taking gun cases, specifically from New York, because all the gun control laws that were passed last legislative session, they sat on his desk for 9 months. Right. Because he was agonizing over, I don't want to trigger a constitutional challenge on this thing. Because the Democrats in the Assembly and Senate don't care. They just write whatever crazy stuff comes into their head and just pass that and say, oh well, like if they want to sue us over it, whatever. Not realizing that if we win, that's precedential and it may result in them never being able to pass a gun control law like this ever again. That's why they're so concerned about that Ninth Circuit case. Not that the arms transport rule only in New York City gets reversed, which it already has, but if the court looks at why lower courts upheld that rule as constitutional, they're going to have to look at why that was the case. So how courts decide whether or not a gun control law is constitutional in New York State, they apply levels of scrutiny to that. All right, so in New York, they use what's called intermediate scrutiny, which is like a watered down test that is not applied to the First Amendment or others. Strict scrutiny applies there. But if it's guns, we basically just say to the legislature, are you trying to achieve some kind of special public safety interest? Oh yes, Mr. Court, yes we are. Okay, Mr. Legislature, well that's the end of that case, and they just dismiss them all. That used to happen to us all the time in the Second Circuit until last February, when we went to argue our pistol permit case. And we were gonna, I'm driving down there with our attorney, James Ostrowski, and I turned him in the car and say, what do you think about just mentioning that this Ninth Circuit case is gonna be heard by the court, and that they should think about that because they're taking gun cases now, and they're gonna review all their decisions. And he goes, I don't know if we want to reference pending litigation that hasn't even been heard. We didn't even have to. 2 of the judges on the 3-judge panel specifically brought it up and challenged the state attorney general's deputy attorney who was arguing against us if she believes that that's going to impact her case and cripple it. And she didn't want to answer the question. She's like, it's a New York City case. Like, I understand that, but they're probably going to look at the level of scrutiny that this court used, so they're concerned about their work being reviewed. Don't you think that's going to impact this case? And the attorney's like, this should be an easy case. I mean, we've got these plaintiffs here, some of them have misdemeanors on their records. It should be an easy case. They don't have standing. They're not law-abiding. The case should be dismissed. We had already made the argument that under the DC versus Heller case, the 2008 case, that for the first time held that you have an individual right to keep and bear arms disconnected from service in a militia, meaning you don't have to be in the military. The only restrictions on firearms ownership and carriage per the Constitution is a felony conviction and or civil commitment under mental health law. And one of the judges said to the Attorney General's deputy, Well, yes, this person has some misdemeanors. He hasn't tread a straight and narrow path, but Heller speaks of felonies and mental health commitment. This person doesn't qualify under either. And her jaw almost hit the floor. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It shows that the mere presence, the specter of Supreme Court review under a conservative majority is enough to scare these lower courts into at least giving us something. And if we get into the Supreme Court and they articulate a strict scrutiny standard, which requires the government to state precisely the reason why they're doing this, why they believe it's going to serve an important governmental interest for public safety, what data and studies they've engaged in that are empirical, that lead them to believe that, of which the state never does any of those ever. They just say it's our belief that this will produce a positive outcome. And then also, the other kicker is that the government needs to prove under strict scrutiny they're going about these restrictions in the least restrictive means possible, which means the end of the SAFE Act and magazine capacity limits and bans. Because a blanket ban on every civilian in America from owning, or at least in New York State, from owning an AR pattern rifle is certainly not the least restrictive means of avoiding mass shootings. It isn't. Because the psychology behind that is it's so paternalistic. There's no civilian in all of New York State who's not a police officer who could possibly handle the responsibility of owning an AR pattern rifle or a standard capacity Glock, although in 46 other states they seem to get along just fine doing that. So it basically creates a situation where if you can get the left to overreact in New York, you can get a standard put in place that requires strict scrutiny, and they won't be able to pass anything like this anymore, or they can try, and it's going to be overruled in the lower circuits. So it reduces the timeline it takes for us to reverse some of these laws if you get a decision like that, because it doesn't have to go all the way up into the federal system anymore. Your lower appellate divisions and state Supreme Courts are going to be compelled to follow the standard, and they're going to have to apply it. They're not going to like it, but they're going to have to do it. In the back?
Yes, around that same topic, on the assault weapon style firearms. Why are these other states are being subjected now to these same arguments, and they're losing as well? The left has the argument won right now, and we're not finding a loophole in their attack on assault weapons. They're able to say it's constitutional. The appeals courts are not overturning these things. There's no winning going on in that area. So what is the hypothesis? How do you dissect? They're winning right now. Why are they winning?
Well, that's actually not all totally true. I mean, in March of last year, the Duncan v. Becerra case reversed the magazine capacity ban in California for a week, and now it's going to be in front of the Ninth Circuit. But it's not true that all of these circuits are unanimous and that all the lower courts are unanimous. They're still applying different levels of scrutiny. They're still making different arguments, and this issue hasn't reached the Supreme Court yet.
And we can't buy them in New York, and soon Virginians won't be able to buy them. So you have an angle or an argument that civilians need to be just as tactical as the police. The police had to get more tactical back in 1997 with riots in LA because they were outgunned. Well, civilians are outgunned by the criminals, so we need to have that argument. We need to have that discussion.
Well, right, I guess it depends on what this is kind of what I tell everybody, it depends on what your end game is and the consequences you're willing to bear. Like I accepted a call from an organizer near the Albany area not too long ago who wanted to organize a rally and said, can we open carry in Albany? And so I replied back, I said, yes, with consequences. Because you can do anything you want with consequences. So this idea that you can't own an AR pattern rifle in New York is false. You can build one. You can still get an 80% lower right now, and you can manufacture one. The state is going to try to restrict that through demand letters to companies that don't operate here. But it's all about what consequences you're willing to bear. Now, if you want to take the traditional path and litigate these things in the courts, is the time horizon going to be longer? It is. It's probably going to be measured in decades. And you'll get your permission slip from the government to do these things. But if that's not satisfactory to you, and it sounds like it isn't, you can do other things. I guess my reply to that is just there will be consequences. Yep.
My question is, based on what he said too, the Supreme Court has already turned around and said you can have these weapons. How is New York State with the SAFE Act and places like Massachusetts and Virginia now instituting these laws and saying, no, you can't?
Well, first, I'm not aware of a Supreme Court case that expressly says that you can own an AR pattern rifle. It broadly says that people have the right to keep their arms for common purposes, lawful purposes.
And I don't mean to interrupt you,
Yep.
but I can't remember the Supreme Court justice who passed away, but he came out and said.
Anthony Scalia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Anthony.
Yeah.
The most popular form, the AR-15
Right,
form,
right,
he
right.
said that was something that, since we all have, we're allowed to have.
Well, his argument is that because this is a very popular rifle in the hands of law-abiding people for lawful purposes,
Correct.
that is protected by the Constitution. However, that is one Supreme Court justice's opinion. It's not a case precedent that came down as an opinion from the court.
Oh,
Now,
see.
I agree with Anthony Scalia's view, and that's also Brett Kavanaugh's view. It's also Neil Gorsuch's view. It's also Clarence Thomas's view, more than likely. So, a case like that is going to have to be heard by the court at some point. I think they're ready to do it now. But to get back to your other point as to how do these lower courts in New York State, Massachusetts, and the other leftist utopian states get away with this, they apply intermediate scrutiny. That's what I was saying earlier. And because we don't have any guidance from the Supreme Court that says what the correct level of scrutiny is, they get away with that. Now, if the court decides, with respect to this Ninth Circuit case that's still pending, to address the scrutiny standard and say a heightened level of intermediate scrutiny is correct and the one applied here is not, or basically anything about scrutiny levels that does not comport with what happened in the lower courts, we can go and reopen all these other cases and say there's a new standard of review here that you failed to apply. And the court has said something new on this, and now you have to abide by it, so we'd like all these cases reviewed once again. That's why the original Ninth Circuit case challenging the SAFE Act went away, is because, they weren't confident in the ruling they were going to get from the Supreme Court, so they just didn't appeal it anymore. Now's the time to appeal all these things. And the thing is, you've got 30 years to do it. Unless, this is why the progressives are upset about this, and they want to pack a court. These judges serve for a very long time, and a lot of them are young enough where it's going to be decades where they can issue these rulings. And I think that the conservative majority, based on what they've said and how they've acted on the bench with respect to the Ninth Circuit case, are very ready to give a positive ruling on this. So, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. We need to be very organized at the grassroots level about tracking the infringements against people. And that's very much what we do with our organization, is all across the state. We have a red flag gun confiscation hotline on our website, a form submission. We get submissions every day, sometimes like 10 to 20 a day. Same thing dealing with SAFE Act charges. We have one up there. We even have one for military bases. We were going to represent a guy not too long ago who is from Kentucky, where they don't have permits at all, and was a delivery driver for military bases, and he went to Fort Drum. And he carries, it's a Beretta concealed carry pistol. He had it unloaded in one lockbox with ammunition in another lockbox with the magazines. So he drives up to the base, and the protocol at every other base he's been to is you have to let the MPs know about this, and they're going to tell you either they'll hold it for you while you make your delivery, or you're going to have to go to an FFL or a pawn shop or something and have them hold it there. But that didn't happen at Fort Drum. The MPs there took him out of the vehicle and held him at the access control point and called the state police, and the state police came and arrested him and took custody of the weapon. There's some problems with that, and we may still have some litigation to do here, literally against the MPs of Fort Drum. That's a violation of federal law because it violates what's called the Posse Comitatus Act, and also Title 18 of the U.S. Code, which is a conspiracy against rights title. Okay, so what those say is that federal officials on civilian soil cannot enforce civilian laws, right? This is what the left went apoplectic over when Trump sent the Marines and other contingents of the military to the border to assist with, border enforcement he was hoping to do. And the left said you can't, it violates Posse Comitatus, which was true. Well, it's true in this instance as well. So we held a press conference regarding that, and we even have literally a hotline dealing with that. So truck drivers or civilians who go on military bases who get held by MPs who call the state police to come and enforce state gun control law, that's illegal under federal law. I know the MPs don't want to believe that's true, and they are just taking orders. And I know this is relationship building because a lot of MPs get out of the military and become state troopers. And this allows them to build a relationship with the state troopers. That's awesome. Hold some type of professional group. Don't do it by infringing on people's rights. So, that's sort of what I mean by we need to become more strategic in watching what the state is doing and being very aggressive immediately and pointing out when they overstep their bounds. Because again, we want to resolve the cultural conflict peacefully, and the best way to do that is to demonstrate that the left continuing on this trajectory will have very bad results for them. In the back.
Yeah, so you have, say, a two-time felon gets arrested, and he's got, guns, whatever, drugs. They got enough charges on him. How damaging is it to our cause when they add, oh, look, a SAFE Act provision we can tack on to his charges every time? Cuomo's back there patting himself on the back over it.
I've seen that happen several times, and even actually more times than I'd like to see. And that actually, when we got started as 2AWNY, that's how we found out that the DA in Erie County was prosecuting 7-round limit violations, which were imaginary. There were some individuals driving around at 3 a.m. in the morning in downtown Buffalo, smoking weed and drunk in the car, and got pulled over by Buffalo PD, and they found a loaded Glock on them that had 10 rounds in the magazine, and they got charged with a 7-round limit because the Buffalo PD felt that they were gangbangers and they wanted to hit him with everything. That does legitimize the law. And if you've done good police work and you've built a solid case and you've been disciplined about it, you will have enough to convict them on that. You don't need to add a SAFE Act violation to that just to get them or to try to put the screws to them. If they really did something that's felonious or that bad, you can get them on that law alone. So I'm very much against applying a SAFE Act charge to it. Basically, the case is already airtight. I mean, they throw this stuff on to like someone who's 5 charges deep already. It's just stupid. So I agree. It is damaging. It further legitimizes the law because, of course, what's going to happen is when that's challenged at a later date, the state's going to point to all that and say it's a long-standing law. It's been applied many times in many cases all across the state. Therefore, it's presumptively lawful. That's what they're going to say.
Well, that should be in the resolution then.
You can certainly add that. That county, well, I mean, basically, my understanding is you would simply say that county law enforcement will not enforce any portion of the SAFE Act, correct? Or at least the magazine capacity limits and the blanket ban on AR pattern rifles. You at least hit those 2 areas, and that takes care of your problem right there. Any other, right there?
So how does jury nullification come into play if there's an individual being charged and then there's a jury trial?
I'm glad you brought that up. We were in Syracuse on the 14th of January to talk about jury nullification and tell Central New Yorkers that they should use that to stymie the state's ability to convict people on imaginary gun laws like the SAFE Act. Jury nullification works very well because you can create a hung jury on a case like that. It almost happened with respect to the Ben Wassel case, which is the one we reversed, because there was a jury of people who basically said to the judge, we don't understand what the SAFE Act is saying with respect to its classification of assault weapons. We don't believe that they pose a danger, and we don't understand what this actually means, like what all this language means. So we're not comfortable convicting someone for something we don't even understand. Now, Judge, if you can explain to us what it means, then we can reconsider. And they went back and forth, and he eventually admitted, I don't understand what it means either. But I know that it's illegal, and you have to convict this person. And he basically bullied him into convicting him. And judges will do that to everybody. Most judges, county, state, and federal, do not like jury nullification. They do not like the concept of it. But that is what the constitutional republic was founded on, is the people's ability to judge what is lawful and what is not. And if you can stop prosecution at the grand jury level, which happens before the trial, that's the best possible time to do it. And this is what I'm talking about with respect to public relations, media engagement, marketing, and grassroots organizing. How many people in this room also knew about jury nullification before she brought that up and what that means? That's more than usual. But to make it have an impact, it's got to be like the whole room. Because that jury pool has got to have at least one person on there who A, knows about it, and then B, is going to withstand the browbeating by the judge to say, I don't care what you say, not going to convict this person. And then you have a hung jury and there's nothing they can do. That's the end. So, with respect to that type of stuff, it's better to do it at the grand jury level, where before it goes to trial. So grand jury, for those who aren't aware, that's basically the decision-making body that determines if charges will be brought. And then if it goes to trial, now you've got a trial jury that's judging the facts of the case and determines the outcome. In a trial situation, it's a bit more difficult because the prosecution and defense will be more stringent with jury selection. They're going to try to weed people like you out They know that you know about jury nullification. And you can't stand outside the courtroom and say nullify this trial. You can't do that. What you can do is stand up there and just talk about jury nullification. You can do that. That's been upheld by Supreme Court precedent. There have been individuals who've literally done that in downtown Manhattan, handed out nullification pamphlets in front of the Second Circuit that went to the Supreme Court and that was found constitutional. So you can talk generally about jury nullification in front of a courthouse. You cannot say nullify this trial because that prejudices the jury. So it's a tool that should be used. So that goes back to my earlier point about we are in a 4th and 5th generation warfare conflict against the state. It's an asymmetric, unconventional war. We have to use a multitude of tactics to nullify gun control that go beyond simply asking the legislature to reverse because they won't. Part of that is nullifying the impact of the law. Part of that's jury nullification. Other questions?
So are there any counties that are actually moving forward with the sanctuary movement right now, and where is the status of that and other counties in New York?
There are numerous other counties that are having the discussion. I'm involved with 12 counties involved, including this one, where people have reached out to me personally and we've had various discussions, be that a group of 3 people, in a room about how to start, all the way up to and including the full legislature meeting with me and us discussing it. So there are various levels. I'm not aware of any legislature that's actually is actually ready to pass this yet. They're still very early stage. And I mean, really, if you look at the life cycle of this thing, they've only been really seriously looking at this for a couple months, is the general impression I get from most of the legislative bodies I've talked to, is they may have been seriously considering this for 60 days at the most. They saw what happened in Virginia. The advocates in their county were emboldened by it and were encouraged by it and started pressing the issue. So I think with time, like when you get to quarter 3 or 4 of the year, if someone's going to move forward with it, it'll probably happen by then. But again, the approach is critical. We have to have the approach of not leading with, hey, very emotionally, like we want this to happen. We want you to do this, just do it. It's gotta come from the perspective of we understand the consequences, we understand the risks of doing this. We're very wide-eyed and upfront about what the risks will be. We've studied them. We have a plan in place to mitigate those risks that are in the ordinance, and also we have legal representation for you, for which you're not going to have to pay county funds, and they're ready to litigate this thing based on the ordinance language. That message has to come out right at the beginning. We've already thought of everything for you. We've already thought the 10 steps ahead. The misstep I see in most counties is the people who want to push the ordinance put that on the legislator. They're not going to do that because it's their career. So you got to do that work for them.
Do you have a sample resolution for the legislature?
So I know that the majority of the counties have been using the Gun Owners of America resolution, and I've been working on making putting some ideas into that counties could use. I mean, I'm not going to ever say to somebody like, this county's got to do it this way. It's more, I made this argument up here. Based on this argument, I'd recommend that this stuff be in the ordinance because then you can back it right into a lawsuit. And that should come out. I did issue a form of that 2 days ago to some folks who are doing this in other counties. I'm going to put it up online after some comments come back because it's basically draft language and it's up for review. So it's kind of a community review process, and on the 2AMYS website, when we're all pretty much aligned, then yeah, it'll go out there and everybody can use it. In the back?
So are you involved with St. Lawrence County, that meeting, it looks like you're
I've not heard from St. Lawrence County, no. So if they'd like to talk to me, you'd have to talk to them. I think you had a question earlier. Did we get to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So with the governor's last foolish act in Albany, letting the no bail laws come out.
Sure.
And turning criminals out by the hundreds, gang members, every single day, the recidivism level is ultra high.
Right.
Why wouldn't any of these county officials / law enforcement officials, which in this area are, I'll say, opposed to this sort of thing, why would they have that kind of outlook? I mean,
you mean opposed to bail reform, not
opposed
the
to the Second Amendment sanctuary. They don't want to talk about it. We don't want to hear it. We like it status quo. It's either that they're worried about their personal reputations, their benefits, whatever, the community be damned.
So you're talking about, just so I'm clear, you're saying that law enforcement officials in upstate counties, even in the wake of bail reform, are still
I'm
opposed to Second
I'm
Amendment
talking
sanctuary ordinances.
about this county.
This one specifically,
And they've
okay.
been anti-Second Amendment for a while. We've had candidates run in the past that are pro-Second Amendment.
Sure.
The left pushed them to the side every time. So it's the good old boys club at the top of the law enforcement pyramid that don't wanna hear this sort of thing. So when
Yeah.
the shit hits the fan, for lack of better terminology.
Sure.
The constituents of this county will do what they want to do. And look,
Yeah.
here's something that a lot of folks probably don't think. The governor can come and sweep and clear every weapon off the street. They haven't addressed the problem. It's called the black market.
Well,
You can
yeah,
get
that's
whatever
an
you
issue
want
too,
off the
exactly.
black market. So take away all the guns and let all these criminals that Emperor Cuomo's letting out by the hundreds every day run the streets.
Right.
What are they gonna do?
Well, so there's a lot there, so let me try to address, I think there's 3 or 4 points to address there. One is with respect to law enforcement, maybe in this county or others that you might be referring to, who are reticent to embrace the Second Amendment sanctuary ordinance idea, or maybe as it's been drafted and presented to them. They may not have heard the argument I made tonight. That's probably the case. So I think if we can better educate officials on a better way forward, a more strategic way forward than maybe what's been presented, they might reconsider. If they don't, then obviously you can work to remove those people. Or you can work to simply not recognize their authority.
Yeah, they're close.
Those are things that you can do as a citizen, so there's that component of it. The other elements of your comments have to do, I think there's like sort of groping for logic in what the left is doing, and again, there is none. So, if you're gonna have bail reform, right, which to some extent, criminal justice reform, there should be some type of reform made. The way the state is doing it is not the way. And the way that the state is doing it in any form is gonna result in some people being let out who are gonna, reoffend, maybe reoffend multiple times in a week. So if you're gonna do that, again, going back to my earlier argument, if you're gonna disarm people, what offensive capability will the state give up? If you're gonna release criminals who may reoffend, then you need to give the people the ability to defend themselves, which would be concealed carry permits. That would be the logical thing to do, because you literally cannot have law enforcement officers on every street corner. It's not feasible from a tax and spending standpoint. It's also not the best way forward from a civil liberty standpoint to do that type of thing. So for that reason, you want armed people, you want armed civilians who can defend themselves. So, there's no logic there. Once again, there's no logic in anything that they do. And so trying to find that logic is pointless. You just have to understand that it's like a mental force field with these people. They hate the fact that people have weapons. That's it.
So law enforcement understands this bail reform act.
Mhm.
They're not even gonna attempt to take these people into custody because we gotta process them and then cut them loose.
Correct.
So-
Probably over time, that will be the result.
Just in the last 2 weeks, we've had over 29 incidents within a quarter mile of my house.
Mhm.
Violent things, break-ins, vehicles being stolen. Law enforcement silent.
Well-
We're not gonna touch any of this.
So this is the type of intelligence gathering that goes back to my, that should be occurring at the grassroots level and shared with a group like ours. It kind of goes back to my other point. This is the type of stuff that we would want to come out and do a press conference on in your county and all the other counties. So look what the progressive policies have wrought on this community. The idea, this is what the court always tells us, we're going to believe in the predictive judgments of the legislature on gun control. The predictive judgments of the legislature couldn't predict their way out of a paper bag. They're terrible at this. And this is just another example of that. I mean, you can also take a look at what's happened in Buffalo with the Tesla plant right now as another example. They couldn't predict the fact that the thing is worthless now, even though they've given them billions in tax breaks. So that's the type of thing that you want to shine light on in the beginning, and then you get more aggressive with time. So in the beginning, we do media events on this type of thing. We demonstrate that in your county, here's what the results have been. We demand that the county provide concealed carry permits for residents because bail reform has made it more dangerous on the streets. And then if the county denies that, then you sue them. I mean, we're ready to do that right now. Again, we have literally a lawsuit that's active in every county and ready to go in this one too. So anybody who's denied a unrestricted concealed carry permit for a frivolous reason, meaning if you're not a felon and you have not been convicted under mental health law, committed under mental health law, civil commitment, then under Heller, the Heller decision, you should get a firearm immediately. Like you go and apply for the permit, Okay, we found out you're not a felon, you've never been committed civilly under mental health law, here's your permit, that means you can carry today. It should be that simple. Not drafting this stupid letter, the Mother May I letter, that explains, here's my special circumstance, please let me, please let me. That's all made up ridiculous crap. And it's also not mandated by the state. You know, those restrictions are made up by the county and they can stop doing them at any time. So if they're not gonna stop voluntarily, then we need to compel them to do that. So we would do that through a lawsuit, and then we would follow up, and we would review what law enforcement has done and what the DA has prosecuted in the years following. And if they're still enforcing that unconstitutional law later, then we sue them civilly and personally. And we start taking their personal money. And then if that doesn't work, then we get more aggressive from there. So those are the pathways forward. So like with respect to the 7-round limit violation, we need to know when these things happen. So that goes back to my point on grassroots organizing. People who get caught up on a 7-round violation need to know to call us or submit that information through our website, so then we can start tracking that stuff. And then if we need to, we can go and sue the relevant parties. The message needs to be sent that we're never gonna stop doing this. And if it is sent successfully, then the county and state will eventually give up.
All right, last question.
What's your website?
It's the numeral 2, A like alpha, NYS like NewYorkState.com.
That was a quick one. We can do one more.
Yeah.
And also, when you go to leave, if you're physically able, if you could please take your chair to the back and any other chairs around so that we can help clean up.
Right there.
I mean, everybody in this room is for this, for the most part, I would guess, or we wouldn't be here.
Right.
So my question is, we all know Cuomo's probably one of the most underhanded people
Oh, yeah,
that
that's true.
exists.
Yeah.
So if we sign this petition, I mean, it's gonna go to the county level, it's gonna go to the state level. Is this petition with all of our names on it gonna turn into a government hit list? I mean, is the governor gonna say, hey, go get him, he signed that petition? Is
So-
Cuomo gonna do this kind of thing? Is he that underhanded?
So anything's possible, but again, like going back to my prior point of like all the negatives that we listed of the governor removes the sheriff or the legislator to the DA and sues the county and takes the money away. I would like him to do that, because then we can sue him for all those things and get it out of the state court system and get some good precedents on the book. It would also be a very bad decision for him to do what you just said. So I hope he does do that. And if he does that and you find out you're being retaliated against, that's what's called 2 things. First Amendment retaliation. You have a right to free speech, and the government's retaliating against you for doing that. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2 is the people have the right to redress government or to petition government for redress of grievances. That's why we have the court system. The court system exists so people can non-violently petition the government for redress of grievances. When the government retaliates against you for doing that, not only is it illegal, but it delegitimizes that court system and gives you license to resort to violence. So,
Like Cuomo's done it before.
yeah, well, I would imagine that they probably don't want you to do that. But with respect to the legal argument I just made, if that were to happen, then we would be more than happy to sue the governor on your behalf and everyone else here for First Amendment retaliation and, retaliation for attempt to redress grievances through the court system.